These are some of my favorite tools inside of Photoshop, and I use them all the time. I'm going to show you how I use them and why they're on the top of my list. Let's get started. Puppet Warp is by far one of the most useful tools for me as a compositor, especially when I have a figure, or actually what this works really well on also is fabric. If you need to move fabric around like a really long dress or whatever, this is really useful. So to use the Puppet Warp, you just go up here to Edit, Puppet Warp, and probably initially you'll see this mesh. Now you can turn the mesh on or off if you want, and then you can place anchor points around your object. And however you're going to warp it, you'll use the anchor points for that warp. So if I just place one anchor point down here, I can't really warp it with only one anchor point. What I need to do is have more than one, and then I can warp it around those anchor points. So if I put an anchor point here in the upper body and one in the lower, now I can grab this bottom anchor point and I can warp it based on these two. For example, if I wanted to just bend her torso a little more, which she's already really bent, but let's say that I wanted to just exaggerate that for the sake of the image, I might put an anchor point here right in the middle and then take this top one and bend it back. Now if I don't show the mesh there, you'll see how I'm just giving her some additional exaggeration. You can also put these anchor points in joints around the body, and then you can use them to give some bend. Now obviously at a certain point you make things look really unrealistic and crazy. And if you've never tried taking a straight rope and giving it a little bit of a turn and putting it where you want it with the Puppet Warp tool, it makes life so much easier inside of Photoshop. Definitely on the top of my favorites. When you're compositing, you're almost always going to do some amount of cloning. Cloning is really, really useful, but it's difficult to do in perspective. So one of my favorite tools that Photoshop introduced a while back was the Vanishing Point filter. So up here in Filter, if you go down to Vanishing Point, you can now create a vanishing point plane for yourself, and I'm going to do that here by clicking four corners to a rectangle, essentially a plane. So I'm going to use this road as an example. I'm just going to stretch it out and create what looks to be about correct for the plane of this road. Now my idea here is I want to expand this road. I want to make it a 3-lane road, for example. So now I have this plane, I can grab the edges of it and I can stretch it. You'll notice that as I'm doing that, it's retaining the same plane geometry that I gave it there when I stretched it out the first time. So I'm just going to go ahead and stretch it all this way. Now I'm going to go and grab my clone brush. Still inside the Vanishing Point filter, I'm going to start painting with that. So I'm just going to, let's sample this area of the picture right here. So I'm going to add a lane right over here. And I want to add it in perspective. You'll notice as I move this around that my clone brush is moving in perspective to my Vanishing Point plane. So if I just go ahead and start painting here, and man, this is brilliant. I just added an extra lane to this road with minimal effort in perfect perspective, especially for things such as buildings, windows, anything flat plane is very, very useful for compositing. The layer style dialog is full of all kinds of useful things you can do, such as texturing, stroke, inner shadow, inner glow, satin. However, one of my favorite things inside of it is the blend if options. Now I use this all the time with compositing, and there are a number of uses that are possible for it, but I'm going to show you one here that I really like, which is sometimes I end up having to paint on skin. Either I'm painting on, war paint, or I'm painting on a tattoo, or I'm painting maybe even on like a superhero costume, like a skin tight suit. Let me go ahead, I'll put a layer over top here, and let's just imagine that we wanted to paint on some sort of a superhero suit on this person. So I'm just going to make a really rough rudimentary outline here. So now I've painted in this blob of where, clothes might be on this model. So now let's go in to blending options on this layer, And I'm going to start tweaking the blend if option. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the underlying layer slider on the black side and I'm going to drag it in a little bit, because what I want is to get rid of that suit anywhere that there is absolute black. And then you'll notice that these little arrows, they have a divider down the middle, and if you hold down on the option key, you can split them and click and drag one away from the other, and it just gives you a little more control. So I am actually dragging one side of the black over to give a soft fade. So it's blending it if the layer underneath it is that level of black. And then I'm going to, holding option and clicking, or alt if you're on a PC, I'm going to split the white side and I'm going to drag it towards the left a little bit. What you'll see is I'm now seeing the highlights from her skin tone showing through my layer. Let's hit OK, and then I'm going to add a clipping mask to this. You can just create clipping mask, and look at that. I mean, that is a start to a skin tight costume, or even a shirt that we could paint on her. And of course we need to do a little bit of shading, a little bit of extra painting, but look at what the blend if did. Such a useful thing, especially if you're trying to retain highlights while you're putting a texture over. Using the white side to retain those highlights, very, very useful, and just makes things look a lot more realistic. So the generate assets option in Photoshop is something that I didn't know how to use for a really long time, but it is extremely useful and it takes very little effort. And especially if you intend to use your images for some sort of animation at some point where the layers will all move. So let's say you're working inside of a composite like you see here, and let's say that eventually I would like to separate the foreground from the background and just drop it in one of those photo animator softwares and give it a little bit of movement. For example, in this image, you'll notice that right here, I click on and off. This is the woman that's in the image. And so what I've done is I've named this folder woman.png. And then I have over here, this is the platform. And I'm going to name this platform.png. And then I'm going to go over here to File, Generate, and then Image Assets. Now, when I do that, you won't see anything happen inside of Photoshop, but what happens is inside of the file location where you've saved your file, it's now going to generate some assets for you. So for example, right now when I did that, this folder popped up inside of the main folder that I was working on this image in, and it generated these two assets. It generated this and it generated this. And it did that from the folders right here. And the fact that I gave it a .png told it what file type to generate as. So in this case, I wanted it to be transparent, so I gave it a .png. But you could also give it a .jpeg extension if you wanted, and it would generate assets for a JPEG. And then just turn that off when you're done with it, and you'll notice that now there's no check mark by it. Now it won't generate assets anymore. So you got to remember to turn that on if you want these folders to generate an asset. Super useful, especially if you're going to be working with animations or going to be parsing these layers out later for some other reason. And while I'm here in this file, I'm going to show you another one of the often overlooked, super useful features inside the Layers panel. I often work with a lot of layers, and you'll see in this one, I actually have folders and they're all they're closed up, but if I were to expand all these, you'd see that I have an awful lot of layers inside of this document. And quite frequently, you can just lose layers altogether. Or if you're saving your document, it's taking a lot of file space, you may have layers inside of it that you're not actually using. You dropped in at some point in the compositing, but they're no longer in use. And what I like to do is I'll use this filter. I will go here to Attribute, and you'll see it automatically flips the switch over here for filter. And what I'll do is I'll select the not visible. Well, then now that I've done that, I can just grab all the not visible layers, drop them in the trash, and I'm done. Once I'm at the end of the image and I'm tidying it up, I know that those not visible images aren't being used, so I can just get rid of them entirely. Another really useful feature of this is if I go back to kind, I can filter just by, say, adjustment layers, or I can filter just by text layers. If you've ever worked in a document where you've got some text and a lot of images, you can just easily find your text layers only using this filter. And of course, you've got a lot of other things such as mode, color, smart object, artboard, and whatnot. But those are some of the ways that I use it most often. I will say though, be careful. Once you start using it, sometimes you'll just find that you have the filter on and you'll look at your layers panel and you'll be wondering what in the world, like I can't find anything. Just make sure to flip that filter back off and then all of your layers will be right where they were. So these are a few of the tools I use all the time. Now there are lots more tools that I use and I'm sure that you do too. I'd really love for you to hit me up in the comments and tell me some of the tools that you use all the time when compositing, and tell me if there's some tools you'd like to see me highlight, certain features or certain options inside of Photoshop. Thank you guys for watching. Please click subscribe, like if this video was helpful, and I'll see you next time.